Capitol Report is a production of Senate Media Services.
On this week's program, recent mass shootings prompt DFL senators to call for gun reform legislation, and lawmakers take a victory lap at a St. Paul hospital to celebrate the passage of significant investments in mental health services. Stay tuned for this week's Capitol Report. Welcome to this week's program. I'm Shannon Loehrke. Governor Walz held a ceremonial bill signing at Children's Minnesota to celebrate a new law that provides $90 million to improve mental health services.
These are important steps towards helping the kids in our community who are really, truly struggling. Among the things included in this bill, Children's Minnesota was granted an additional 22 bed licenses so that we can open a new inpatient mental health unit, which is set to open this fall. It'll be here on this St. Paul campus. We just walked through. Construction is underway as we speak. And it's going to be the first mental health unit in the East Metro that will serve kids under the age of 12 years old. It's also one of the few in the states that will be able to help kids who have both mental health issues as well as complex medical issues.
To the advocates who are here on this issue of understanding children, as Lieutenant Governor often says, don't come in pieces. We should treat holistically the child and the family. And doing this tour up here of these 22 beds and all of the things that are being thought of in that care. And one of the things is each and every one of those rooms, those private rooms, comes with the extra space for a parent to be there with that child.
There's a lot of love that goes out for mental health in the Senate and in the House. And it is probably the most non-partisan bill that I've worked on. Everybody came to the table, worked together for this solution. And that's what legislation should be about, is the solution for the people.
One of the things that we heard was that half the people who go for licensing to do this work dropped out along the way. One of the reasons they drop out is because they have to pay out of their own pocket for their supervision. We put a substantial amount of money in to help provide grants so that people who need supervision can afford the supervision to make this happen.
We know that mobile crisis services work. We know that providing culturally informed and responsive services work. We know that school-linked and shelter-linked programs work. We know that providing intensive services in foster homes work. We know that inpatient psychiatric care works. We know that programs to intensively treat and support people experiencing their first psychotic episode work. All of these effective programs received additional funds in this bill, expanding the number of people they can serve.
In 2019, it was our first trip to the emergency room. And I didn't know how lucky I was that we were only there 24 hours before a bed became available. That was pre-COVID. I didn't know what I was doing, but I followed the system and my child got the help that they needed eventually. Fast forward a few years, and things were pretty different. In November of 2021, when it was 72 hours that my teenagers spent in an emergency room while we waited for a bed to become available. But as we were describing what this new unit will provide these children and their families, I was visibly taken aback to know that if my child by any chance has to be in that unit again, as a parent, I can actually stay with them.
After the event, I was able to grab some of the key lawmakers behind the mental health package to get their thoughts on the investment. I began by asking the Senate's chief author, Senator Rich Draheim, how the bill came to be.
We started out with nonpartisan staff looking at a list of all the mental health bills in the Senate. And we didn't look at who was authoring it. We just broke it down into sections based on need and what it was attacking, what aspect of mental health, and there's a lot of different solutions out there. And we had to work within our budget, and we put it all together. And, senators from both sides of the aisle had worked on similar bills in previous years too. So everybody was on the same page. It was just duking it out on priorities. So it happens a lot.
So in your mind, what is the most important aspect of this bill?
Well, I think when we look at, there's two components that was my driving force on creating the bill, and one was more access, and the second was more professionals. So on the access piece, I would say the hospital bed moratorium, getting rid of that for a 5-year period, I think will do the most good. Let's let hospitals like Children's figure out what works for their market, because every part of the state is different and they might have different needs. And then let's come back in 5 years, review what they did, what worked, what didn't, maybe learn from it, and help nudge the programs a different direction if they're not successful or not. And then for the access, or for the professionals in the industry, I think was touched on in the press conference. One was the supervision piece, and I think that was a big missing component. And then, of course, there are some grants for people to get through their education.
You said that in the conversation prior that this is a first step. Is mental health going to be sort of an ongoing focus of yours?
It has been a focus since I got elected. Kind of one of the disappointing factors that we've had, that we haven't done more for mental health when everybody agrees, but yet we can't cross the finish line. I didn't think we were going to get it done. It was 10 minutes before midnight when the House took up the bill. So we're very fortunate to get that across the finish line. I am urging the Senate to have mental health onto a committee separate from the Health and Human Service so it gets more attention.
What makes it important, groundbreaking in your mind?
Two things I would say. First of all, it was a level of bipartisanship and working together that I haven't seen in a long time with the legislature. I got to see some very powerful legislators get together, put aside their differences, and really grind down to a solution. The second part is it's acknowledging and showing the legislature gets that we're in a mental health crisis, and it set aside its differences to actually have some serious solutions to help to address many of the problems that we see happening, especially among chronic youth mental health issues. And that's what I'm most concerned about right now, whether it's in schools, emergency rooms, or in-home facilities or outpatient. We need to be doing better by providing more in all aspects.
And in your mind, do the resources, is this a good start? Or, I mean, how far along the way does this go?
I think this is a good start, but it cannot be in any way seen as the solution. The reality is that we have so much more work to do, especially in this COVID environment, to recognize that we've got to be way more nimble in providing more resources outside of the box what we normally do, because we get locked into these channels and things don't get done. Greater Minnesota needs it, and the kind of mental health they need and the kind of services they need are different than here because there aren't any hospitals, or as many hospitals, I should say, or emergency rooms. So we have to be really thoughtful and nimble to meet the needs of the region, and that's what I hope the next step is, that this sets up as the next step, is to really look at our regional approaches and meet the needs of the people where they're at.
What is the importance of this mental health law?
Well, it's very important. One thing it shows we can actually get something done in a world where people think we fight all the time. And to get something of this substance, put together $60 million for the mental health and $32 million to work with this competency restoration, great problem in the arena that we have now is excellent. And the testimony you heard today from the mother, there's no place to go with your kid, and now 22 beds we can spend time with them. More school-based mental health, more staff drawing into the arena. With all the workforce crisis, we have to find a way to put our money where it's really important, and into the lives of our young adults and young teens, where they might not make it the next year. It's a pretty important place. And so I think we do agree. We agree that let's find out what's really important, let's deal with the critical issues. This is one of them, and what a time to celebrate.
And you do know a fair amount about mental health just from human services and human services reform. Is this a good first step? Is this a big first step? How big is this step?
Well, it's a good 9th step on the way to 50. And so the system continues to evolve in terms of people needing care, but a different kind of care they needed 20 years ago and different than 20 years ago before that. And so as it evolves, it's always catch up. Okay, we have this program and it didn't work for my kid, didn't work for my brother. Oh, let's learn something new. Oh, now we need to make it a little different version. And so part of what's passed in here is the latest, which we didn't think of 15 years ago with the Governor Plenty bill that we passed, a similar size bill that I was part of more directly. And in 5 years, there'll be something else to do and so on. And so there was a law passed about mental health parity and insurance. And so that's not going as well as it's supposed to be. If they did their job, to have the insurance companies pick up the tab, there would be much less gaps. But in the meantime, the state's picking up the slack, and so the taxpayers get to pay, and I'll just say thank you for caring. It doesn't come light on their budgets, but I think as a state we agree this is really important to do.
I know mental health is important to you. We've talked about it with regard to many things, but this bill here, this new law, what is the importance, the significance in your mind?
Oh, it addresses all the issues that we're facing, you just march right through all those issues, and we put money in every single one of those issues, whether it's workforce training, the supervision, the homes for the adolescents. The Safe Passage was an experiment, and it turned out to be an amazing project. So we expanded that, the extra money for School Linked. One of my favorites is the money for the counties that are actually the best ones to do this work for their adult mental health block grants. And we equalized all that, so the winners and losers were not created. Everybody can move forward with whether they invest in mobile crisis units or some kind of infrastructure, and providing those wraparound services that are so very important to mental health.
Everyone is talking about the bipartisan work that went into this. And are you hopeful, if there's a special session, that there could be more of this kind of bipartisan work? Does the legislature need to learn lessons from how this got done?
Oh, I think we've learned our lessons. And if you look back, there are so many projects and bills signed that were truly bipartisan. We live and work in a unique state with this divided government. So we've had to learn how to develop those relationships and create a working environment that both can walk out and say, well, that hurt, but we can live with it. And that's what we end up. But with this bill, I actually probably would have liked to put a little more money into mental health services, but this is what we ended up with.
Last week, Senate DFLers called a press conference to say that gun reform legislation should be included if a special session is called.
As leaders, we won't sit idly as more lives are lost to gun violence and more grief is imposed on families. DFLers are committed to responding to that grief with action to prevent future tragedies, and we are calling on our colleagues on the Republican side to help us by agreeing to finish the public safety bill and adding common sense gun prevention, gun safety legislation to it.
These are enormously popular proposals on a bipartisan basis. The mid-80s in percentage, 84, 85, 86% of all of Minnesotans support both of these bills. That's Metro and non-Metro. That's GOP, Independent, and Democrat. And that is gun owners as well as non-gun owners. We are not going to propose that these are the solutions to gun violence in Minnesota standing alone. Clearly they're not. They'd be a very important piece of the puzzle. But we need a more comprehensive effort, like as proposed in the combination of the Senate and the House proposals pending before the conference committee, or that were before the conference committee, that we could revive at any moment to pass in a special session.
Federal law requires anyone purchasing a handgun to be at least 21, but to purchase a rifle or a shotgun or a semi-automatic weapon, you have to be 18. Minnesota currently does not have separate age limit requirements. So what we plan to do is to introduce a bill to raise the age limit to purchase a rifle or a shotgun, and that includes a semi-automatic military-style assault weapon to the age of 21. We know Minnesota is a hunting and fishing state, so the bill will still allow kids to enjoy hunting. We're not going to change that. We will just end their ability to purchase these military-style weapons, these weapons that were designed for war, that were designed to kill. Maturity and responsibility vary greatly among 18 to 20-year-olds. The brain is still developing. This is recognized in other areas. Those under age 21 can't buy alcohol, they can't rent a car, and they can't buy handguns. So we think those same age restrictions should apply to these semi-automatic war machines.
In the Twin Cities, we have children who are killed when they're playing outside on their trampoline. We have children who hear gunshots as they're walking to school or as they are sleeping. In greater Minnesota, we are seeing an increase in firearm suicides. In 2020, 68% of firearm deaths were actually suicides. 53% of those 68 were white males in rural Minnesota. Each suicide impacts 147 people. No matter where you live in Minnesota, this is an issue that impacts you. We need background checks, and we need to invest in mental health resources that are readily accessible. We need to invest in after-school and summer programs for children and look at enhancing our conceal and carry laws. We can do both, and we need to do both. I say this as a gun owner. The Second Amendment and safety measures are not mutually inclusive. They can exist together.
I spoke with the ranking minority member of the Senate Judiciary and Public Safety Committee, Senator Ron Latz, about the Senate DFL's call for gun reform initiatives. The two pieces of gun reform legislation, closing the gun show loophole and establishing a red flag law, are not new. In fact, you've been championing them for some time. Have the recent mass shootings in Texas and New York created momentum for change?
Well, Shannon, thank you for having me on today. The answer is yes and no. The answer is yes, because clearly we want to do something to stop massacres like what happened in Uvalde. On the other hand, we've had massacres like this on a regular basis for decades, and we haven't seen that brief moment of momentum translate into any meaningful change on the legislative level. Unfortunately, there are many of us who stand up and say, we got to fix the laws to make it harder for these things to happen. And we have equally vociferous people on the other side of the political equation here saying, oh, wait, not so fast. First, let's figure out how we can address the sadness that's here. And let's bury the people who died, and we'll give a little more thought and don't want to rush into anything. So we're getting pushback immediately all the time after these mass shootings, these horrific events. And the question ultimately is, are we able to overcome that resistance and actually get something done? We need something a little more sustainable in terms of the political pressure to get the change. And unfortunately, the only thing that may be sustainable is a regular occurrence weekly of these mass shootings, so that pressure doesn't let up. And of course, no one wants that. So ultimately, it's going to require, I think, the political will of the legislators and the constituents to be putting that pressure on their own legislators to make change.
As I said, one bill that you're proposing would close the loophole so that the loophole that people use to get around background checks, namely the private seller purchase. So if I want to buy a pistol or a semi-automatic military-style assault weapon from a federally licensed gun dealer, there is a process that would verify that I'm okay to make that purchase. But if I want to buy one from my friend's uncle, for example, there is no process. I can just go do that. Is that correct?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, there's a two-part process to this. One is get you into a transactional system where you have to go through the background check. And then the second part is making sure the background that is checked has sufficient data in it to screen out those who are ineligible under law to purchase the firearm. The loophole here is the gun show and the private party transactions. Those transactions don't even have to go through the background check at all. There's just no system for that. You can go to the gun show and 90% of the sellers there might be licensed dealers that will run you through a background check, but there are going to be 10% of the sellers there that are going to sell you guns off their table or out of the trunk of their car without requiring any background check. So it doesn't matter if you're a felon, doesn't matter if you've got a murder conviction, doesn't matter if you've got a domestic abuse conviction, all of which under current law would make you ineligible to purchase a firearm. If no one checks on it, there's no barrier to you getting that gun. And same with the private party transactions, not just the gun shows. If you're buying over the backyard fence from your neighbor, same thing, no background check.
So let's say this bill were to become law in Minnesota, then I would not be able to make that purchase without a background check. But what is to prevent me from simply going across the river to Wisconsin?
Federal law. If there were to be passed a federal law, then you wouldn't be able to bypass Minnesota by going to Wisconsin. All of your purchases would be routed through a licensed dealer. Our proposal actually for the background checks would set up a required permit to purchase system, so that you could get your background check when you obtain a permit to purchase your firearms. And then you would be able to go from a purchase from other sources, some private parties or at gun shows, but there would be substantial penalties for people who sell it to you without you having a valid permit to purchase. So your background check then happens at the point when you apply to the local sheriff's office or law enforcement agency to get that permit to purchase.
Your second proposal has been enacted in 19 states and is also part of the recent gun reform framework that has been developed in Washington, D.C. by 10 Republicans and 10 Democrats in the U.S. Senate. And I'll ask you more about that in a minute. But it's what people call the red flag bill, or extreme risk protection, or crisis intervention orders. It does appear that this initiative is gaining traction, and you noted that a majority of National Rifle Association members do support it. Why is it important?
Well, the fact is that there are people who have moments of emotional instability and where they just aren't themselves. And that includes gun owners as well as other people. And right now, there aren't any tools in the toolbox to separate those people at those moments from the guns that they have. And if their emotional instability, whatever the cause is, it might be the loss of a job, it might be a dispute with a neighbor or with another person, it might be the breakup of a relationship that's got them very distraught. And they're thinking either about suicide, killing themselves, or lashing out against someone else that they're having a tough situation with. Everyone, people have those situations, and those who have guns in the household or that they have access to are more likely, if they're going to get violent, to use the gun rather than some other means. Before there were this kind of prevalence of guns, they might get into a fist fight. I challenge you to a fight. Even if it's a knife fight, you're a lot less likely to die or kill someone. Or if you try to commit suicide with a knife, you're a lot less likely to be successful in your endeavor to kill yourself. If you've got a gun, you're 97% likely to kill yourself instead of just injure yourself. And frankly, suicides are the leading source of gun violent deaths in Minnesota, and especially in greater Minnesota, in the rural areas and other parts of greater Minnesota. So these so-called red flag laws give law enforcement the tools to get a court order, an independent, objective judge, to issue an order to surrender those firearms, and gives law enforcement the tools to go get them. And at least while the crisis is in effect, to separate those firearms from the person who's in crisis.
Before we go, I mentioned the bipartisan group of U.S. senators. They've agreed to a 9-component framework, at least, of gun legislation. And this would be the most significant movement toward federal reform in decades. What are your thoughts? And could successful passage of federal reform break the logjam here in Minnesota?
Well, yes, I think it could, or it might take some pressure off the incentive for the state to do something. It's really hard to say. The federal reforms, in my judgment, don't quite go far enough. And so I think we would still be pressing in Minnesota to make more meaningful change. And that's not to say the federal reforms themselves wouldn't be important if they're passed. One thing that's notably not on the federal list is more thoughts and prayers, which is the reaction that a lot of people who don't want meaningful change in this area turn to after every crisis, after every horrific massacre. They say, well, you're in my thoughts and prayers. We're praying for you. We hope this never happens again. We're sorry for your loss. But the fact is, thoughts and prayers don't bring dead people back to life. And the fact is, thoughts and prayers have been proven over and over again to be ineffective in preventing these kind of gun violent massacres. So the federal efforts won't include thoughts and prayers. They will include, a waiting period before purchases for assault weapons and firearms for people 18 to 21. But it won't ban assault weapons, which in my judgment, don't have any meaningful value and have been proven to be very harmful in society at large. I think we at least ought to raise that age to 21, flat out, no matter what your situation is. We know well the physiology of brain development is that people actually under age 25, but certainly under 21, simply don't have the prefrontal cortex cognitive development yet to have better impulse control. That's well established in the science. It's actually a foundation for the way a lot of juvenile courts operate. But we don't, and we apply that to alcohol, we apply it to cigarettes, we apply it to renting a car, and we apply that to lottery tickets. For some reason, we don't apply that to purchasing assault weapons, and we should.
Senator Latz, we're going to have to leave it there, but I want to thank you so much for taking the time.
Thanks, Shannon.
At a recent press conference, I asked Governor Walz whether he supports including gun reform legislation as part of a possible special session.
I think we should, but I want to make clear that I think passing this budget, I've said this, I said in my State of the State, kind of laying out a roadmap. Let's do UI and frontline workers. Let's move on to some of the things that we know we can get done, veterans and other things. Then let's accumulate that with the budget deal. I think this is a top priority. Lieutenant Governor and I hear a lot about it. I think we should. I want to be very clear. I am not going to give Republicans a reason to not come back and finish the work. But I hope, again, that the public is saying, why would you not do this? You saw that today, the polling came out here in Minnesota. It's massively popular to do the two things that we've suggested in terms of background checks and red flag laws. We know what we saw was some of the mental health help, and I want to be clear, it was positive to see Senate compromise at least to a certain degree, but I think there's things we can do here. So what I would say on that is I think the public is asking us to do something on that, but I want to be very clear. I would not derail a budget deal. We could do both, and there's nothing that would say it, but I want to be clear. That's not going to be a reason not to come back.
Join us again next week as we delve into more topics affecting Minnesotans. I'm Shannon Loehrke, and on behalf of all of us at Senate Media Services, thanks for watching.